Laudetur Jesus Christus. You're listening to Vatican Radio. Hello and a very warm welcome to our live commentary of Pope Francis's visit to the UN office of Nairobi in the Kenyan capital. I'm Philippa Hitchin and I'm here with Bramble Badenoch-Nicholson, who's working with us at Vatican Radio's English program for a couple of months. Hello, Bramble.
Hello, Philippa.
A very warm welcome especially to all our listeners who are following this broadcast on some of our sister networks via EWTN TV, Network TV, Radio Maria, Sultan Light TV, Telecare TV, Catholic TV, and Shalom World TV. Pope Francis, as I'm sure many of you know, arrived in Kenya yesterday in Nairobi at the start of his pastoral visit to Kenya, Uganda, and the Central African Republic. The Pope's first visit to Africa. This marks his first time of actually setting foot on the African continent. And as he arrived yesterday afternoon in Nairobi, he paid a state visit to President Kenyatta and addressed the country's political, economic and cultural leaders. Earlier today at the Apostolic Nunciature in Nairobi, where he's staying, he had a meeting with ecumenical and interfaith leaders, the heads of the Anglican, Evangelical, Methodist, Pentecostal, and some of the African Christian churches, as well as leaders of other faiths, the Muslims and the traditional African religions. From the Nunciature, he then went on to the University of Nairobi, which works together in partnership with the University of London in the UK. And there he celebrated Mass on the university campus, focusing on the role of the family, the vital role of the family in Kenyan society. After lunch, he then went to St. Mary's Catholic School in Nairobi, founded by Irish missionaries, and there he addressed priests, religious and seminarians in Kenya, thanking them for the vital work that they do in hospitals, schools and other places of need. And as we join Pope Francis now, he is visiting the UN office of Nairobi in the Kenyan capital. We've just seen him a moment ago. As he arrived, he was greeted by the head of the UN office here in Nairobi, and he's just signed the visitor's book, the Golden Book, as it's called. And you can see also there he's receiving a rapturous welcome from the staff working here at the UN offices, the staff and their families. The UN office in Nairobi, it was established by the UN's General Assembly in 1996. It's the headquarters of the UN throughout the African continent. Bramble's been doing a bit of research into these offices. Tell us a bit about them, Bramble.
Yes, so the complex of buildings is located next to the Karura forest and across the street from the US Embassy in Kenya. And it contains a green building, which is a completely energy and carbon neutral building, which also houses the UNEP and UN Habitat offices. And the building is the first of its kind in Africa, recycling water and using natural light to reduce reliance on artificial lighting. And it's also designed to use the natural flow of air as a substitute to air conditioning. And it contains solar panels to generate all the energy that the building would consume normally. And it was opened on the 31st of March 2011 by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and also Kenya's former President Mwai Kibaki. And the UNON also hosts the annual East Africa Model United Nations Conference for secondary school and university students from East Africa.
So, as you say, a model of environmental sustainability here on the African continent.
Absolutely.
And I'm pretty sure that we're going to hear Pope Francis talking again in this key speech today about environmental awareness and picking up on many of the themes that, of course, he first presented in his recent encyclical Laudato Si. We heard him also as he arrived in Kenya, as he arrived at Nairobi airport yesterday, talking very much about environmental themes. As he arrived at the airport, he said, Kenya has been blessed not only with immense beauty in its mountains, rivers and lakes, its forests, savannas and semi-deserts, but also by an abundance of natural resources. The Kenyan people, he told the country's political and economic leaders. The Kenyan people have a strong appreciation of these God-given treasures and are known for a culture of conservation, which does you honor. The grave environmental crisis facing our world, he said, demands an even greater sensitivity to the relationship between human beings and nature. The Pope told the political leadership in Nairobi, we have a responsibility to pass on the beauty of nature in its integrity to future generations, and an obligation to exercise a just stewardship of the gifts we have received. These values, he told the political leaders, are deeply rooted in the African soul. In a world which continues to exploit rather than protect our common home, they must inspire the efforts of national leaders to promote responsible models of economic development.
Receptions. You have your work cut out for you inside here.
We're now inside the UN building, where you can see a huge crowd of people, staff, journalists, various diplomats and all sorts of people who work here at the UN office in Nairobi, awaiting the Pope's arrival. He will be talking to the head of the UN office, the Director General of the UN office. She will be making a brief address together with the heads, the directors of the two particular offices here, Habitat, the Office for Human Settlements, and the UN Environment Programme. And let's just take a listen for a moment as the gathered assembly here welcomes Pope Francis into the hall. We can see the papal entourage arriving ahead of the Holy Father. You can see there the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Cardinal Turkson from Ghana, the head of the Justice and Peace Council, Cardinal Njue, the Cardinal here in the Kenyan capital, together with Father Lombardi, Father Federico Lombardi, our very own Director General, and the head of the Holy See Press Office, accompanying the Holy Father on all of his trips abroad. And in just a moment, we should see now the Pope coming in together with the Director General here of the UN office in Nairobi. Just a word or two about her. She is Madam Sahle-Work Zewde. She's Ethiopian, and she was appointed as Director General of the United Nations office at Nairobi by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on March the 11th, 2011. She was the first person to be appointed to the newly created position as head of the organization's Nairobi office at the Under-Secretary General level. Madam Zewde brings to this position more than 2 decades of experience at national, regional and international levels. Prior to taking up her functions as Director General of the UN office at Nairobi, she served as Special Representative and head of the UN's Integrated Peacebuilding Office in the Central African Republic. As a career diplomat, she also served as Director General for African Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia, her native country, from 2006 to 2009. Prior to that, she was ambassador to France and permanent representative to UNESCO, located there in Paris, and accredited to Tunisia and Morocco. She's also served as ambassador to Djibouti and ambassador to Senegal, with accreditation to Mali, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Gambia, and Guinea. That was from 1989 to 1993. So really a wealth of experience she's bringing to this position as the Director General of the United Nations office at Nairobi.
Symbolically here at the United Nations, he will be joining us momentarily. And you promised to give him a rousing, warm Nairobi UN welcome. And as soon as I see him, I will let you know. I will definitely let you know. I suspect that you may see him before me. And if you do, give me a heads up.
Pope Francis is running just a few minutes late, about 20 minutes late for this appointment at the United Nations office in Nairobi. As you may have heard there, on his way in to the building, he symbolically planted a tree in the grounds around the UN building here. Planting a tree, of course, an important symbol of environmental protection.
Will not be coming from there, but he'll be coming from the left.
Well, you can hear the excitement mounting here inside the main hall of the UN building.
Your eyes on my left, your right. Okay?
The Master of Ceremonies awaiting the Pope's arrival, and as you can see, crowds of UN staff, diplomats, family members, all holding their cell phones high, holding up their mobiles to snap a shot of the Holy Father as he enters the hall. He will be arriving in just a moment, together with the Secretary General, the Director General, of the United Nations office here in Nairobi, and the executive directors of the two main UN buildings, the Human Settlements Program, known as UN Habitat, and the United Nations Environment Program UNEP. And the executive directors of those two programs will give a brief address to the Pope, together with Madame Saleh Work Zewde, the Director General of the UN office in Nairobi. Pope Francis will then address the gathered assembly here in what is likely to be one of the key speeches of this trip to Nairobi, and he's bound to be addressing not just Kenyans, but Africans, people throughout the continent, and indeed the entire international community, as he has done when he has addressed other UN offices. You may remember earlier this autumn in New York when he addressed the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and this time last year when he traveled to Strasbourg to address the European community in Strasbourg.
Is continuing a portion of the program he wasn't able to continue when it started raining. So he is heading over to what we call here the North Building, the new office facilities, but it's actually a green building, where he is going to receive a briefing from Achim Steiner, the director of UNEP, as well as a short update on the challenges surrounding climate change. So I plead with you to relax and give the pontiff a few more minutes. I will be back. Thank you.
The Master of Ceremonies there asking the assembled crowd just to be a little bit patient, as Pope Francis is running slightly behind schedule for this visit to the United Nations office in Nairobi. He is being accompanied by the Director General of the office, the Ethiopian diplomat Saleh Work Zewde. She is going to be making her entrance here with Pope Francis in just a few moments, just before Pope Francis set off for this first visit to Africa.
All eyes on the Pope, and as of now, everybody keen to hear what his message on climate change is.
You can hear the local commentator there in Nairobi, also waiting for Pope Francis's arrival. Just before his departure for Africa, we interviewed the Director General of this UN office, Madame Saleh Work Zewde, about the issues that the Pope would be talking about.
I believe, 3 days or 2 days away.
During that interview, the Director General of the UN office at Nairobi said that many of the issues that Pope Francis will, in fact, be highlighting throughout this 5-day visit to Africa reflect the challenges which the United Nations itself is facing as it marks its 70th anniversary. It was founded, of course, in 1945 in the wake of the Second World War. Madame Saleh Work Zude spoke to my colleague Linda Bordoni, who is in Nairobi following this papal trip for us. They talked together about the future of the United Nations in Africa. She described Africa as a continent that needs the United Nations more than any other continent in the world today. And she went on to say, the Director General of the UN office went on to say that the issues that the Pope will be talking about during this visit to Kenya, Uganda, and the Central African Republic are issues that resonate much more in Africa than anywhere else in the world. Issues, for example, of inclusion, solidarity, environmental protection, social justice, and dignity for all.
And his trip here in Kenya, and indeed his address to the UNEP here in Nairobi, is coming just days before a crucial UN summit aimed at curbing climate change. So there is the Pope there making his way. And Pope Francis has taken on a vocal note in the fight against climate change. And we have heard him since his visit to the country, which is yesterday, injecting a moral voice into a debate usually dominated by economic and political concerns. Once again, his remarks yesterday coming on the eve of a United Nations climate conference in Paris, which will gather more than 145 world leaders for a 12-day summit aimed at securing a climate rescue pact. Pope Francis has said that environmental concerns should be at the forefront of responsible economic development. And of course, once again, just
as you can see,
yesterday when he said
the pontiff is very close to here.
Culture of conservation,
everybody,
which does
please stand
honor
to receive His Holiness.
But then again, calling on
Pope Francis, the Bishop of Rome, escorted by the Director General of UN, the two Executive Directors of UN and Habitat and UNEP. Please give a rousing, warm welcome to the Pope. Nairobi, we did not hear you welcoming the Pope. Turner, another one. I think we need one more to help the Pope ease his pressure. Can I hear one more welcome from Nairobi at the United Nations, please? After His Holiness sits, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Director General of the United Nations Office here in Nairobi, Saleh Work Zude.
My blessing.
Well, you heard an incredibly warm welcome there for Pope Francis as he arrived at the UN office of Nairobi in the Kenyan capital.
Your Holiness, Pope Francis, Excellencies, Ambassadors and High Commissioners, dear United Nations colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Your Holiness, it is an honor to welcome you to the United Nations office at Nairobi during your first and historic trip to Africa. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon very much wanted to be here to welcome you to this United Nations headquarters. However, other pressing commitments, in fact, linked to the upcoming climate change summit, have prevented him from being here. He sends his regrets. 2015 will certainly be remembered as one of the rare times when concerted and extraordinary global efforts were made to contribute to the betterment of humanity. It holds the potential to be a real turning point in human history, given the confluence of events during the course of the year. 2 months ago, world leaders unanimously adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, which opened an era of hope and expectations, and also an opportunity for a genuine partnership in our global village of one human family. All eyes are now on the Climate Change Summit in Paris early next week, where we hope world leaders will live up to expectations by reaching a meaningful agreement. During this pivotal year, 2015, the United Nations has celebrated its 70th anniversary. It has been an opportunity to take stock of our achievements, of which there are many. But most of all, this is the time when a lot is being done in order to make the United Nations more fit for purpose and even more relevant than ever. Your presence here today, 2 months after your historic address to the United Nations General Assembly in New York, where you set the tone even before world leaders started engaging on the post-2015 development agenda, is a testament to a vital mission you share with the United Nations, namely to build a better world for all on a more peaceful and healthier planet. Your visit is an inspiration to us all and carries special significance for the United Nations family. Indeed, this compound is not just the only United Nations headquarters in Africa and the entire global South. Nairobi also is the global headquarters of 2 very important United Nations programs that you just visited, UNEP and UN Habitat. In fact, the only 2 global UN programs based on the continent. With country, regional, and global offices, this compound is an important center for the delivery of the United Nations' vital assistance efforts in Kenya, in the region, and around the world. Over the past decades, many critical humanitarian operations and peace efforts supported by the United Nations have been carried out from this compound, aimed at assisting some of the most vulnerable people in the world, in South Sudan, in Somalia, and in the Great Lakes region, among other areas. The members of the United Nations community based at the headquarters in Africa have a special and indeed a unique opportunity to advance the goals and values of the organization because of our proximity to the most vulnerable people we are here to serve. Africa needs the United Nations more than any other continent. The United Nations has been the last refuge for the powerless, the hungry, and the needy. All activities of the UN are of particular relevance to Africa, a continent facing many challenges, from poverty, inequality, social injustice, and exclusion, to trans-border, trans-regional issues such as violent extremism, migration, and illegal trafficking. On behalf of all the United Nations staff members in Kenya, I wish to thank you for coming to speak to us today, and thank you for your passion, commitment, and leadership in promoting peace, dialogue, and a life of dignity for all. I thank you very much for your attention.
Saleh Work Zude there, the Director General of the United Nations office at Nairobi.
My two colleagues, Dr. Joan Close, Executive Director of UN Habitat, and Mr. Achim Steiner, Executive Director of UNEP, to make a few remarks. And I'll start with Dr. Close. Dr. Close, please.
Santidad, déjeme que me dirija a usted en castellano, ya que estamos en una sede multilateral.
Dr. Juan Clos, the Executive Director of Habitat, a former mayor of Barcelona in Spain, who is going to address Pope Francis in Spanish.
Lo que deseamos es escucharle a usted. Desde UN Habitat solo le quiero decir que estamos muy agradecidos al hecho de que haya proclamado su última encíclica y que en ella haya hecho esta apelación a la mejora de las condiciones de vida de los más pobres y que además haya tocado algunos de los retos fundamentales de la humanidad. En el continente donde estamos tenemos diversos retos que atender y uno de ellos muy especialmente es el crecimiento desbordante de las megaciudades y la concentración en ellas de situaciones de pobreza extrema. En este sentido estamos seguros y convencidos de que Su Santidad el Papa,
Dr. Close addressing Pope Francis, wishing him a very warm welcome as he visits the UN in Nairobi, and talking about the many challenges facing humanity, in particular the growth of extreme poverty.
Condiciones de vida para los más pobres que viven hacinados en las grandes ciudades. Gracias.
Talking about the United Nations' ongoing commitment to facing up to these challenges, a commitment to continue to try and serve the poorest in the world today. Pope Francis there exchanging a few words with the Executive Director of the UN's office in Nairobi.
On behalf of all my colleagues at the United Nations Environment Programme, I join the Director General and the Executive Director in welcoming you to Nairobi. It is an honor for us to host you in the headquarters of the UN in Africa and the city of Nairobi, which we in UNEP have been proud to call our home for over 4 decades now. The place from which we lead the United Nations effort on the environment, an effort that your voice carries with a renewed sense of urgency that the world needs to hear and is hearing. As both a leader of faith and a leader in our global community, your voice reaches across many boundaries. You have spoken to the challenges of our time with compassion, clarity, and empathy. You have shown unwavering commitment to confronting injustice, intolerance, and inhumanity. And you have combined the force of science and knowledge with the spiritual values and moral orientation. Through Laudatio Si and more recently in your address at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, you shared a vision of a world where people and nature can live in harmony. That inspiration guides us in understanding our responsibility to each other and to our planet, which today provides for 7 billion people, but must soon support 9 billion people. Addressing the world just a few days, as you will in a moment, before the Paris Climate Conference, with the future of this planet literally hanging in the balance, You remind world leaders, business leaders, and individual citizens that we each have not only a responsibility, but as you emphasized again yesterday, an obligation to act on what our conscience tells us to be right. The United Nations has a unique role in focusing effort on climate change, in forging consensus to allow the world to act together. We are the first to acknowledge that at times it can be a painfully slow journey from recognizing the challenge to delivering solutions. Yet, however slow, the progress is steady, and as we have already seen with the reversal of the damage to the ozone layer, which began its journey in this very building and hall and campus here in Nairobi over 30 years ago. So, in the field of environment, yes, the United Nations does work, it does make a real difference, and it does improve the lives of millions of people. That is why what has resonated for me personally is your ability to frame our collective and personal obligation in terms that are full of hope. This is exactly the mindset we need. In this very pivotal year, your powerful notion of the globalization of indifference speaks to the heart of the practical and ethical challenges ahead, both to reach a climate change agreement in Paris, indeed, and to deliver it within a much broader and holistic spectrum of sustainable development that must leave no one behind. That approach has embedded climate change into the global consciousness, not just the science on harmful emissions and wasteful practices that contribute to them, but the well-being of a healthy planet that includes justice, equality, and solidarity with the most vulnerable in society, and the very people who are often the least responsible for the problem, but are the most affected by the consequences. At a time when world leaders face some of the toughest decisions in a generation, the agenda for sustainable development does demand hard choices between the narratives of conflict and competition that carry such seeds of destruction, or striving towards an inclusive society that looks beyond self-interest to create jobs and opportunities and most of all hope. This cannot just be about the narrow pursuit of economic growth, as you have so often said. It must be about the value and the future of humanity living in harmony with nature and with each other. Your Holiness, thank you for being with us today, and even on a rainy day, rain in Africa is a very beautiful thing. So take the quantity of rain. You know, there is a country called Botswana which even has named its currency as the pula, which is the rain. So it really is a gift, and I think you have gotten a great deal of it today. But let me thank you for being with us today and for speaking from the heart of Africa to the hearts of people across the world. Thank you.
Achim Steiner there, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, thanking Pope Francis for his visit to the UN and talking about the pivotal year 2015.
His Holiness Pope Francis to deliver his address. Your Holiness, please.
Pope Francis now making his way to the podium and urging his audience to be seated as he prepares to make his address in Spanish today, one of the UN languages. If you have just joined us, you're listening to our live commentary of Pope Francis's visit to the UN office in Nairobi, the Kenyan capital.
Deseo agradecer la amable invitación y las palabras de acogida de la señora Sale Worksed. Directora General de la Oficina de las Naciones
for her kind
Unidas
invitation
en Nairobi,
and words of welcome,
como también del señor
as well as Mr. Achim Steiner, Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, and Mr. Joan Clos, Executive Director of UN Habitat. I would like to take this opportunity to greet all the staff members and all of those associated with the institutions who are here present. Even though they may not be here now, all of those who are involved in the daily work here. On my way to this hall, I was asked to plant a tree in the park of the United Nations compound. I was happy to carry out this simple symbolic act, which is so meaningful in so many cultures. Planting a tree is first and foremost an invitation to continue the battle against phenomena like deforestation and desertification. It reminds us of the importance of safeguarding and responsibly administering those richly biodiverse lungs of our planet, which include, on the African continent, the Congo basins, a place which is essential for the entire Earth and for the future of humanity.
I'm not sure if you can hear the official simultaneous translator there at the UN office in Nairobi, but Pope Francis has begun by thanking the Director General of the UN office at Nairobi, as well as the Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme and the Executive Director of UN Habitat. He also thanks all the personnel and all those associated with the institutions present in the UN office. He noted that on his way into the hall, he was asked to plant a tree in the park of the United Nations Center, saying he was happy to carry out this simple symbolic act, which is so meaningful in so many cultures. Planting a tree, he says, is first and foremost an invitation to continue the battle against phenomena like deforestation and desertification. It reminds us, he says, of the importance of safeguarding and responsibly administering those richly biodiverse lungs of our planet, which include on this continent the Congo basins, an essential place for the entire Earth and for the future of humanity. The Pope says it also points to the need to appreciate and encourage the commitment of international agencies and civil society organizations which draw public attention to these issues and offer critical cooperation, employing legitimate means of pressure to ensure that each government carries out its proper and inalienable responsibility to preserve its country's environment and natural resources without capitulating to spurious local or international interests. Planting a tree, the Pope says, is also an incentive to keep trusting, hoping, and above all working in practice to reverse all those situations of injustice and deterioration which we currently experience. In a few days, the Pope says, an important meeting on climate change will be held in Paris, where the international community as such will once again confront these issues. It would be sad, he says, and I dare say even catastrophic, if particular interests were to prevail over the common good and lead to manipulating information in order to protect their own plans and projects.
Either to improve or to destroy the environment.
In this international context, Pope Francis says we are confronted with a choice which cannot be ignored, either to improve or to destroy the environment. Every step we take, he says, whether large or small, individual or collective, in caring for creation, opens a sure path for that generous and worthy creativity which brings out the best in human beings.
It belongs to all and is meant for all. Climate change is a global problem.
The climate is a common good, Pope Francis says, belonging to all and meant for all. Climate change, he says, is a global problem with grave implications, environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods. It represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. Our response to this challenge, he says, needs to incorporate a social perspective which takes into account the fundamental rights of the poor and underprivileged. For the misuse and destruction of the environment are also accompanied by a relentless process of exclusion. The COP21 conference, Pope Francis continues, represents an important stage in the process of developing a new energy system which depends on a minimal use of fossil fuels, aims at energy efficiency, and makes use of energy sources with little or no carbon content.
And we have an example here. We are faced with a great political and economic obligation
The Pope says we are faced with a great political and economic obligation to rethink and correct the dysfunctions and distortions of the current model of development.
a clear signal in this direction.
The Paris Agreement, he says, can give a clear signal in this direction.
As I already said before the UN General Assembly, we avoid every temptation to fall into a declarationist nominalism, which would just assuage our consciences. We need to ensure that...
For this reason, I express my hope that COP21 will achieve a global and transformational agreement based on the principles of solidarity, justice, equality, and participation. An agreement which targets three complex and interdependent goals: lessening the impact of climate change, fighting poverty, and ensuring respect for human dignity.
And an agreement which targets three complex and interdependent goals: reducing the impact of climate change, fighting poverty, and ensuring respect for human dignity.
A pesar de muchas dificultades,
He goes on to say that for all the difficulties involved, there is a growing conviction that our planet is a homeland, and that humanity is one people living in a common home.
And that humanity is one people living in a common home.
No country can act independently of a common
No
responsibility.
country can act
If we truly
independently
desire positive change,
of a
we
common
have to humbly
responsibility.
accept our interdependence.
If we truly
The problem
desire
arises whenever we
change,
think of interdependence as a synonym
we have humbly to
for
accept
domination, or the subject of some to the interests of others, of the
the
powerless
problem
to the powerless.
arises whenever we think of interdependence as a synonym for domination, or the subjection of some to the interests of others, of the powerless to the powerful.
es necesario un diálogo sincero.
What is
What we need
needed is
sincere and open dialogue with responsible cooperation on the part of all. Political authorities,
Political
the scientific
authorities,
community,
the scientific
the business world,
community, the business world, and civil society. Positive examples are not lacking, he says.
and they
They demonstrate that a genuine cooperation between politics, science, and business can achieve significant results.
can achieve significant results.
Somos conscientes, sin embargo,
At the same time, we believe that human beings, while capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves. choosing again what is good and making a good
Choosing again what
start.
is good and making a new start.
This conviction leads us to hope that, whereas the post-industrial period may well be remembered as one of the most irresponsible in history, humanity at the dawn of the 21st century will be remembered for having generously shouldered its grave responsibilities. If this is to happen, the economy and politics need to be placed at the service of peoples, with the result that human beings, in harmony with nature, structure the entire system of production and distribution in such a way that the abilities and needs of each individual find suitable expression in social life.
Find suitable expression in social life.
Far from an idealistic utopia, this is a realistic prospect which makes the human person and human dignity the point of departure and the goal of everything.
And the goal of everything.
This much-needed change of course cannot take place without a substantial commitment to education and training. Nothing will happen unless political and technical solutions are accompanied by a process of education which proposes new ways of living, a new culture.
A process of education which proposes new ways of living, a new culture.
This calls for an educational process which fosters in boys and girls, women and men, young people and adults, the adoption of a culture of care. Care for oneself, care for others, care for the environment, in place of a culture of waste, a throwaway culture where people use and discard themselves, others and the environment.
Discard themselves, others and the environment. By promoting an awareness of our common
origin, the Pope says, of our mutual belonging and of the future to be shared with everyone, we will favour the development of new convictions, attitudes and lifestyles. A great cultural, spiritual and educational challenge stands before us, and it will demand that we set out on the long path of renewal.
On the long path of renewal, and we still have time to accomplish this.
We still have time.
Many are the faces, the stories, and the evident effects on the lives of thousands of people whom the culture...
Pope Francis goes on to say many are the faces, the stories, and the evident effects on the lives of thousands of persons whom the culture of deterioration and waste has allowed to be sacrificed before the idols of profits and consumption. The Pope says we need to be alert to one sad sign of the globalization of indifference, the fact that we are gradually growing accustomed to the suffering of others, as if it were something normal, or even worse, becoming resigned to such extreme and scandalous kinds of using and discarding, and social exclusion as new forms of slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, prostitution, and trafficking in organs. Pope Francis says there has been a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from the growing poverty aggravated by environmental degradation. They are not recognized by international conventions as refugees, he says. They bear the loss of the lives they have left behind without enjoying any legal protection whatsoever. Many lives, the Pope says, many stories, many dreams have been shipwrecked in our day. We cannot remain indifferent in the face of this. We have no right.
We cannot remain indifferent to this. We have no right to do so.
Together with the neglect of the environment,
Pope Francis goes on to say, we have witnessed for some time now a rapid process of urbanization, which in many cases has unfortunately led to a disproportionate and unruly growth of many cities, which have become unhealthy to live in and inefficient. There, he says, we increasingly see the troubling symptoms of a social breakdown, which spawns increased violence and a rise in new forms of social aggression, drug trafficking, growing drug use by young people, loss of identity, a lack of rootedness, and social anonymity.
And growing drug use by young people, along with a loss of identity, a lack of rootedness, and social anonymity. Here, I would like to offer...
Pope Francis says, here I would offer a word of encouragement to all those working on the local and international levels to ensure that the process of urbanization becomes an effective means for development and integration. The Pope says this means working to guarantee for everyone, especially those living in outlying neighborhoods, the basic rights to dignified living conditions and to land, lodging and labor. The Pope says there is a need to promote projects of city planning and maintenance of public areas, which move in this direction and take into consideration the views of local residents.
To promote urban planning and maintenance of public areas, which move in this direction of dignified living conditions and take into consideration the views of local residents.
Pope Francis says this will help to eliminate the many instances of inequality and pockets of urban poverty, which are not simply economic, but also, and above all, social and environmental. The forthcoming Habitat 3 conference planned for Quito in October 2016 could be a significant occasion for identifying ways of responding to these issues, the Pope says.
In a few weeks, Nairobi will
In a few days, he goes on, Nairobi will host the 10th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization. In 1967, he says, my predecessor, Pope Paul VI, contemplating an increasingly interdependent world and foreseeing the current reality of globalization, reflected on how commercial relationships between states could prove a fundamental element for the development of peoples.
For the development of peoples.
Or, on the other hand, a cause of extreme poverty and exclusion. While recognizing that much has been done in this area, the Pope says, it seems that we have yet to attain an international system of commerce, which is equitable and completely at the service of the battle against poverty and exclusion. Commercial relationships between states, he says, as an indispensable part of relations between peoples, can do as much to harm the environment as to renew it and preserve it for future generations.
Of the forthcoming Nairobi conference.
It is my hope that the deliberations of the forthcoming Nairobi conference will not be a simple balancing of conflicting interests, but a genuine service to care of our common home and the integral development of persons, especially those in greatest need. The Pope goes on to say, I would especially like to echo the concern of all those groups engaged in projects of development and healthcare, including those religious congregations which serve the poor and those most excluded, with regard to agreements on intellectual property and access to medicines and essential healthcare.
On intellectual property and access to medicine and essential healthcare.
Regional free trade treaties dealing with the protection of intellectual property, particularly in the areas of pharmaceutics and biotechnology, should not only maintain intact the powers already granted to states by multilateral agreements, but should also be a means for ensuring a minimum of healthcare and access to basic treatment for all.
Should also be a means for ensuring a minimum of healthcare and access to basic treatment for all.
Multilateral discussions, for their part, should allow poorer countries the time, the flexibility, and the exceptions needed for them to comply with trade regulations in an orderly and relatively smooth manner. Interdependence and the integration of economies should not bear the least detriment to existing systems of healthcare and social security. Instead, they should promote their creation and good functioning.
The creation and smooth functioning of such systems.
Certain health issues, like the elimination of malaria and tuberculosis, treatment of so-called orphan diseases, and neglected sectors of tropical medicine, require urgent political attention, above and beyond all other commercial or political interests.
Commercial or political interests.
Africa offers the world a beauty and natural richness which inspire praise of the Creator. This patrimony of Africa and of all mankind is constantly exposed to the risk of destruction caused by human selfishness of every type and by the abuse of situations of poverty and exclusion.
Of the poor and the excluded. In the context of economic
relationships between states and between peoples, we cannot be silent about forms of illegal trafficking, which arise in situations of poverty and in turn lead to greater poverty and exclusion.
Lead to greater poverty and exclusion. The illegal trade in diamonds.
Illegal trade in diamonds and precious stones, rare metals or those of great strategic value, wood, biological material and animal products such as ivory trafficking and the relative killing of elephants, fuels political instability, organized crime and terrorism.
And the consequent killing of elephants fuel political instability, organized crime, and terrorism. A cry is rising up from humanity and from the very
This situation too is a cry rising up from humanity and the earth itself, one which needs to be heard by the international community.
In my recent visit
to the United Nations headquarters in New York, said the Pope, I express the desire and hope that the work of the United Nations and of all its multilateral activities may be the pledge of a secure and happy future for future generations.
Of a secure and happy future for generations to come. And so it will be.
And so it will, if the representatives of the states can set aside partisan and ideological interests and sincerely strive to serve the common good.
Once
again, I express the support of the Catholic community and my own to continue to pray and work that the fruits of regional cooperation expressed today in the African Union and the many African agreements on commerce, cooperation and development may be vigorously pursued and always take into account the common good of the sons and daughters of this land.
The common good of the sons and daughters of this continent. May the blessing of Almighty God be with each of you.
May the blessing of the Most High be with each of you and your peoples. Thank you.
And you can hear the rousing applause, in fact a standing ovation that Pope Francis is receiving here at the United Nations office in Nairobi after those very significant words talking about the important work of the United Nations in the area of climate change, the environment, but also, of course, the common good of humanity. We heard the Pope saying that the climate is a common good belonging to all and meant for all. It's also a global problem, he said, with grave implications, environmental, social, economic, political, and for the distribution of goods.
And speaking so forcefully and eloquently on issues that matter to humanity on every single day basis. Thank you very much, Your Pontiff. We are very, very grateful. I would like now to inform you that besides you staying in your place, to allow His Holiness and the Director General to come behind me, and His Holiness will present to our Director General a gift for the United Nations, which will be received by Ambassador Saleh Work-Zewde. I urge you to stay in your places and allow the Pontiff and the Director General to come forward. Please stay where you are.
And so after the official speeches, now a moment for the exchange of gifts, as you just heard there. The Pope and the head of the United Nations office in Nairobi, Saleh Work-Zewde, standing, sharing a joke together and making their way to the end of the podium to exchange a gift, as is traditional on all of the Pope's visits to the different places that he will travel on this visit to Africa. And the first gift that you can see there is the gift that he has brought from the Vatican for the United Nations office in Nairobi. It's a print, a 16th century print showing the erection, the putting up of the Vatican obelisk in Vatican City State. An ancient print from the Vatican libraries. And now we will wait to see if we can catch a glimpse of the gift that is being given to Pope Francis on this occasion. If you have just joined us, you're listening to our live commentary of Pope Francis's visit to the UN office of Nairobi. We've just heard him making Some very significant comments about the important role of the United Nations, not only in protecting the environment, but also, of course, in trying to work for the common good of all of humanity. We've heard him talking about one of his favorite themes, his concern for the globalization of indifference. The fact, he said, that we are growing accustomed to the suffering of others as if it were something normal, or even worse, becoming resigned to such extreme and scandalous kinds of using and discarding people, social exclusion such as new forms of slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, prostitution, and trafficking in organs. And then another strong appeal, as we've heard so often in recent months, about the plight of migrants. The Pope said there's been a tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from the growing poverty aggravated by environmental degradation. They're not recognized by international conventions as refugees, he told the diplomats and UN officials here. They bear the loss of the lives they have left behind without enjoying any legal protection whatsoever. Many lives, many stories, many dreams, he said, have been shipwrecked in our day. We cannot remain indifferent in the face of this. We have no right. Words that will resound very strongly here at the United Nations office in Nairobi. But for the moment, that brings